Hey there, philosophical friend. It is Christopher here, and today we're going to look at Charles Mill's The Racial Contract, and we're going to apply that to important comments made by Trevor Noah regarding George Floyd's murder and the riots and protests that followed. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. I'm Professor Cluse, founder of the Philosophical Life, Real Philosophy for Real Life. This is a channel where we learn philosophy and try to apply it to everyday life. If you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell so you don't miss any future videos. Now, let's jump into the slides. So we're going to unpack Noah's take on George Floyd and racial injustice. We will connect Noah's thoughts with classical social contract theory. We're going to comprehend key parts of Mill's The Racial Contract, and we'll discover how Mill's view refines Noah's suggestive thoughts. Now, here is Trevor Noah, as you may know from The Daily Show, and right now, given that it's COVID-19, he's doing a social distancing version of The Daily Show. And this was a recent episode where he is very kicked back and taken back in reflecting about what he's been witnessing in the last news cycle. And there were many things that happened in the last news cycle that really took him back. But we're going to focus on his comments on George Floyd. And here's what he said regarding George Floyd's murder. He said, quote, "I don't know what that made that video more painful to watch. The fact that that man was having his life taken in front of our eyes, the fact that we're watching someone being murdered by someone's job it is to protect and serve, or the fact that he seemed so calm doing it. Oftentimes we're told that police fear for their lives. It was like a threat. But now, more and more, we're starting to see that it doesn't seem like there's a fear. It just seems like you can do it, so you did it. There was a black man on the ground in handcuffs. You could take his life, so you did, almost knowing that there would be no ramifications." Now, Noah offers a diagnosis of the looting that followed the murder of George Floyd, and he did it in terms of a social contract. Quote, "What is society? It is fundamentally a contract we sign as human beings among each other. Whether it is spoken or unspoken, we say amongst this group of us, we agree to common rules, common ideals, and common practices that are going to define us as a group. As with most contracts, the contract is only as strong as the people who are abiding by it. But if you think of being a black person in America who is living in any place where you're not having a good time, ask yourself this question when you watch those people, the rioters and the protesters, what vested interests do they have in maintaining the contract?" As he continues, and then some members of that society, namely Black American people, watch time and time again how the contract they have signed with society is not being honored by the society that has forced them to sign it with them. When you see George Floyd on the ground and you see a man losing his life in a way that no person should ever have to lose their life, what part of the contract is that? And a lot of people say, what good does this looting, rioting, and protesting do? As he continues, yeah, but what good doesn't it do? That's the question people don't ask the other way around. What good does it do to loot Target? Yeah, but how does it help you to not loot Target? Answer that question. Because the only reason you didn't loot Target before was because you were upholding society's contract. There is no contract if law and the people in power don't uphold their end of it. As we've been going through this, a song that kind of came to mind was Tupac Shakur's Changes. Of course, Tupac died a number of years ago, but this song just really rung true for me now. So I thought it was worth just reading the part of the lyrics. I see no changes. Wake up in the morning and I ask myself, is life worth living? Should I blast myself? I'm tired of being poor and even worse, I'm black. My stomach hurts, so I'm looking for a purse to snatch. Cops give a damn about a Negro. Pull the trigger, kill a nigga, he's a hero. Give the crack to the kids, who the hell cares? One less hungry mouth on the welfare. First ship 'em dope and let 'em deal the brothers. Give 'em guns, step back and watch 'em kill each other. It's time to fight back, that's what Huey said. 2 shots in the dark, now Huey's dead. Huey is Huey Newton, that was one of the founders of the Black Panthers. And actually, Tupac's mom, she was very politically active and I think also involved in the Black Panthers. So Tupac grew up in a very politically active family and culture. Now, let's take a look at social contract theory. And as you can see on the screen here is a picture of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. This is actually the original cover that came with the book when it was published. And as you can see there, there's this Leviathan is a sea monster. In biblical terms, it's a sea monster. And you can see that sea monster rising up out of the sea with a sword and a staff. So staff to guide and a sword to punish. And then you can see that the Leviathan, this king, this sovereign authority over all that town or the Commonwealth, actually has a bunch of people inside of him, like his shirt, essentially, or his body is made up of the people. So essentially, this is the ruler that you give over your rights to have them be a common authority that can legislate and govern. And as we'll see for Hobbes, there's a good reason to hand over your rights to this sovereign because you thereby escape the state of nature. So the social contract has 2 dimensions, and here's the first dimension. This is classical social contract theory. It's first a political dimension that identifies just laws and gives them legitimacy. So laws are just if and only if they reflect the terms of a social contract that free and equal and rational people would accept as the basis of a cooperative life together. There's also a moral dimension, so actions are morally right just because they're permitted by rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by, on the condition that others obey these rules as well. People are basically looking out for number one and want to maximize their own benefits and get as much as they possibly can. But when you do that and there's no common authority to regulate and punish violations of people's autonomy, then what winds up happening is you end up in this horrible state, the state of nature where there is no common authority overall, is, as Hobbes famously says, life in that state is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You live a horrible life, so you recognize I better give up some of my liberties to do whatever I want to others, to snatch whatever I want from others, and give up some of my liberty to the sovereign, so that, assuming everybody does that and is willing to abide by the rule of the sovereign, then it's worth it, because even though I limit my freedoms by doing so, overall I get a better life. Now, for Hobbes and others, the social contract was an actuality. Now, this actually changes in the contemporary social contract theory. So, contemporary social contract theorists basically focus on the moral dimension, and they don't think of it as a historical actuality. And here's a quote explaining this by Russ Schaefer Landau. The state of nature survives only in the attenuated form of what Rawls calls the original position. And the contract is a purely hypothetical exercise. It's a thought experiment in establishing what a just basic structure would be, with a schedule of rights, duties, and liberties that shape citizens' moral psychology, conceptions of the right, notions of self-respect, and so on. So the state of nature becomes the original position. It's no longer what's regarded as an actual historical situation and the transition out of the state of nature into a civil society isn't thought to be actually what happened at some distant past in history, and it's not legitimizing the laws that the sovereign create, and it's not providing moral guidance to the people that live in the society. Instead, it's just a thought experiment for deriving the principles of justice. What does it mean? And specifically distributive justice. That is, what is a just distribution of the benefits and burdens in a society? Well, for Rawls, he derives ultimately two principles out of this hypothetical situation. In the original position, you have a veil of ignorance such that you don't know whether you're male, female, rich, poor, you don't know your ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. So you don't really know where you're going to end up in that society. So you reflect what would be the most just rules that would govern the distribution of benefits and burdens in that society that you will end up in. Now let's take a look at Charles Mill's The Racial Contract. And of course, there's an image of a slave who was whipped by his master. Horrifically and unfortunately. As Mills explains, his racial contract is both a descriptive and a normative theory. Recall, descriptive, you just try to describe what's the case. You try to just sort of capture the facts as they are. A normative theory tries to capture the way things should be, whether or not they actually are that way. As Mills explains, quote, the racial contract seeks to account for the way things are and how they came to be that way, and that'd be the descriptive side of the contract, as well as the way they should be, the normative. Since indeed one of its complaints about white political philosophy and history, I guess, is precisely its otherworldliness. It's ignoring of basic political realities. So when you look at societies, especially like the United States, you see great inequality. And when you look at these idealized classical forms of social contract theory, you see something that looks, in essence, utopian compared to the actual political realities on the ground. As the terms of the contract, the racial contract specify, so this is sort of a technical definition of the racial contract, white people are counted as full persons. To categorize, so you're separating whites into non-whites, to categorize this remaining subset of humans as non-white and of a different and inferior moral status, considered to some degree sub-persons, so that they have a subordinate civil standing in the white or white-ruled polities. So the racial contract starts by dividing whites from non-whites, and then it institutes whites as being in power over non-whites and thinks of whites as people with full moral status, full moral standing, deserving all the rights and benefits of persons, whereas non-whites are considered sub-persons and they don't enjoy full benefits and rights and moral status. Now, there is differential treatment, and it comes into play as, quote, the moral and judicial rules normally regulating the behavior of whites in their dealings with one another either do not apply at all in dealings with non-whites or apply only in a qualified form. The general purpose of the contract is always the differential privileging of the whites as a group with respect to the non-whites as a group, the exploitation of their bodies, land, and resources, and the denial of equal socioeconomic opportunities to them. All whites are beneficiaries of the contract, though some whites are not signatories to it. So even if you reject the contract and you're white, you still enjoy some of the benefits afforded by the contract that sets up a system of moral and judicial rules that favor you as a white person over non-whites. Now, after conceptually dividing people into white and non-white men, quote, the role played by the state of nature, remember we have that state of nature where everything is chaos, and in order to enjoy a life that's worth living, you need to escape it and give up some of your liberties, turn it over to the sovereign. The role played by the state of nature becomes radically different. In the white settler state, its role is not primarily to demarcate the pre-political state of all men. Remember, in the state of nature, it's all for all, essentially eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's a war of all against all, but rather to the permanently pre-political state, or perhaps better, non-political state of non-white men. So essentially, the state of nature becomes sort of like baked in stone into the society, because you have those that are regarded as full political citizens, capable of enjoying full moral and legal rights, whereas you have others that are essentially, they exist in the society, but they exist in almost a subset of that society that's subject to the rules of those governing. And they are essentially a non-political state of non-white men. The establishment of society thus implies the denial that a society already existed. So the creation of society requires the intervention of white men who are thereby positioned as already socio-political beings. Remember, you separate out whites from non-whites, socio-political people from non-socio-political people, and then you have the socio-political people coming and bringing the order and bringing the laws and bringing the rules to those poor people that are non-political. As it says there, white men who are already part of society encounter non-whites who are not, who are savage residents of a state of nature characterized in terms of wilderness, jungle, wasteland. And you see this from history. These, the white men bring partially into society as subordinate citizens, or exclude on reservations, or deny the existence of, or exterminate. In the colonial case, admittedly pre-existing but deficient societies are taken over and run for the benefit, this is what I was talking about earlier, of non-white natives who are deemed childlike, incapable of self-rule and handling their own affairs, and thus appropriately wards of the state. So essentially, they become the property of the state in order to give them guidance and rules that will help them be structured and survive, I guess, because without these political people and this political structure, they couldn't get by, because they're just, as it says, they're savage, living in a crazy wilderness and jungle and wasteland and so on. Now, as it says here, the racial contract establishes a racial state and judicial system where the status of whites and non-whites is clearly demarcated, whether by law or custom, and the purpose of this state, by contrast with the neutral state of classical contractitarianism, and that's the fancy term for social contract theory, is specifically to maintain and reproduce this racial order, securing the privileges and advantages of the full white citizens and maintain the subordination of non-whites. So the contract is set up to basically keep the white people in power and to have rule over the non-whites. Here's an interesting thing that Mills actually comes up with, and I think this explains a lot about what you're seeing in America, where you have oftentimes a denial of white privilege and an inability to even recognize race as a category or a dismissing of any sort of racism. So he says that this racial contract imposes forms of cognitive dysfunction. What's the dysfunction? Well, basically, you agree to misinterpret the world, the facts of the world. So there's always this essentially like skewing of the facts. But that skewing is going to actually be validated. So your misrepresentation of the way things occurred with regard to police and other races and so on, as a white person, will be actually validated. And here's this quote that I think is poignant from Mills. On matters related to race, the racial contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance. So epistemology is usually, you think, a theory of knowledge. And even though you talk about skepticism and ignorance in epistemology, you usually think of an epistemology positively as giving you something, like you're going to learn how to gain knowledge or gain knowledge of facts. What this essentially prescribes, the prescription from this racial contract, is ignorance. It's a particular pattern of localized and small patterns and global cognitive dysfunction. So in small ways, in little things, you'll be ignorant. And in big ways, global cognitive dysfunctions, which are, even though they're dysfunctions, they're actually psychologically and socially functional. So they're actually doing work in society as people act out of their ignorance, producing the ironic outcome that whites will, in general, be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. To my mind, this is a powerful way of explaining why when people recognize or have come into contact with the notion of white privilege, you will often meet with resistance, because what you have essentially is you have a whole way of seeing things that's categorized by ignorance of certain facts. That is, namely, the experience of others or the others in the racial contract. And you sort of deny that reality, or you justify it, or you work around it, why it's not what it is, and why, they're at fault and you're not, as the person in power. And essentially, white people will be unable to understand the world that they themselves have made. This results in, quote, a schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to, there's a purpose for this ignorance, establish and maintain the white polity. So it all comes back to basically keeping the racial contract in place and keeping the power that white people have over non-whites. Now, the racial contract has to be enforced through violence and ideological conditioning. So, as Mills explains, quote, in the early phase of establishing global white supremacy, overt physical violence was, of course, the dominant face of this political project. So you had the genocide of Native Americans in the conquest of the two continents and of Aborigines in Australia, the punitive colonial wars in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, the incredible body counts of slaving expeditions, the Middle Passage, seasoning, and slavery itself, the state-supported seizure of lands and imposition of regimes of forced labor. In the expropriation contract, the subpersons are either killed or placed on reservations so that extensive daily intercourse with them is not necessary, so you isolate them. They are not part of the white polity proper. In the slavery and colonial contracts, on the other hand, persons and subpersons necessarily interact regularly, so that constant watchfulness for signs of subperson resistance to the terms of the racial contract is required. So you need to monitor subpersons as they interact with full persons to make sure that the subpersons are not trying to take back or undermine the power of the people in power. As he says regarding law enforcement, and this connects back to George Floyd's murder and the law enforcement in the United States as a system. Of course, as I mentioned in the last video, there are good cops, there are bad cops, it needs overhaul. But the question is, what sort of system is in place? And is there really systemic racism embedded or ingrained in this system that we find ourselves in the United States? Well, regarding law enforcement, the coercive arms of the state then, the police, the penal system, the army, need to be seen as part of the enforcers of the contract, working both to keep the peace and prevent crime among the white citizens, and to maintain the racial order and detect and destroy challenges to it, so that across the white settler states, non-whites are incarcerated at differential rates and for longer terms. To understand the long, bloody history of police brutality against blacks in the United States, for example, one has to recognize it not as excesses by individual racists, or the lone wolf theory. You just have these bad apples in police forces, and if you can just root them out, then somehow you'll fix the policing system as a whole. Not as excesses by individual racists, but as an organic part of this political enterprise. There is a well-known perception in the black community that the police, particularly in the Jim Crow days of segregation and largely white police forces, were basically an army of occupation. So basically the police force were occupiers of those people that they ruled over and watched and kept at bay and incarcerated and sort of managed in order to uphold the racial contract. Now, white lives as a result of this are valued more as, quote, in all these white and white-ruled polities, attacking or killing whites has always been morally and judicially singled out as the crime of crimes, killing a white person, raping a white lady, and so on. It's like a horrific break with the natural order, not merely because of the greater value of white as persons, of white life, but because of its larger symbolic significance as a challenge to the racial polity. So it's not just that white lives are more valuable than non-white lives. It's any white lives taken sort of act as a symbolic threat to the racial polity and actually challenge its order and power. Now, the death penalty, he continues, the death penalty is differentially applied to non-whites, both in the scope of crimes covered, i.e. racially differentiated penalties for the same crimes, which is documented, and in its actual carrying out. That is, as he mentions there, in the history of the U.S., capital punishment, for instance, over 1,000 people have been executed, but only very rarely has a white been executed for killing a black. Individual acts of subperson violence against whites and even more serious slave rebellions and colonial uprisings are standardly punished in an exemplary way. And I won't try to read that. With torture and retaliatory mass killings far exceeding the number of white victims. Such acts have to be seen not as arbitrary, not as the product of individual sadism, though they encourage and provide an outlet for it, but as an appropriate moral and political response prescribed by the racial contract to a threat to a system predicated on non-white subpersonhood. There is an outrage that is practically metaphysical because one's self-conception, one's white identity as a superior being entitled to rule, is under attack. Now, how might Mills deepen and refine Noah's thoughts? Let's return to Trevor Noah's thoughts. So I hinted at this earlier. Police brutality is not individual racist, quote, bad cops or bad apples, proverbial bad apples, just hurting black people because they can get away with it. Remember, that's what Noah said. He was there, you could do it, so you did it. Almost with calmness, that police officer with the knee on the neck of George Floyd just killed him. Rather, Mills might say, actually, Derek Chauvin, that police officer, is an actor in a larger political structure that is essentially doing his part to enforce white rule through intimidation and violence, even including death. So protest, let's go back to Noah's comments about protests and looting. Protest is an attempt not only to draw attention to injustice, but to abolish the racial contract and attain equal moral and political status. Now, looting, you might say, well, what about looting? Looting is taking back a small amount of the social goods that were unjustly distributed under the racial contract. So the racial contract makes it clear that basically you have no entitlement to a fair distribution of goods and services in society if you are a sub-person or a non-white. And so you might think, instead of, as Trevor Noah suggested, looting is just like, why not do it, right? The terms of the contract have been broken repeatedly by the other side, those supposed to protect and be in power. So all bets are off, and therefore you just can loot. And why not? Because anything goes kind of was where Noah was going. But Mills would actually say, no, actually, to go further with that and really refine it, you would say looting is a way of, in a small way, but you can maybe even say it's symbolic. It's a way of actually trying to take back an unfair distribution of the goods and services under the racial contract. So those that are non-white, especially blacks, are looting as a way of sort of getting what's owed to them in a way, because through generational wealth and through all sorts of structural things that are against them regarding getting jobs and getting high-paying jobs and entering into positions of power, that's all stacked against them. So in a way, it's just a way of rectifying, or at least symbolically representing a reversal of all those years of injustice and unfair distribution of goods and services that they weren't able to enjoy under the terms of the racial contract. Now, Noah assumes a classical understanding of the social contract as legitimizing the power of the state. Such a view of the social contract is, so Noah basically assumes something like the Hobbesian, Lockean, Rousseauian, Kantian version of the social contract. It is by definition classically voluntaristic. You can voluntarily give your consent, and that's what solidifies the contract through voluntary consent, modeling the polity on the basis of individualized voluntary consent. What justifies the authority of the state over us is that we the people. So remember, that's the claim of the United States. We the people, in order to enter into a more perfect union, blah, 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 right? But it was really, at that time especially, just we the white people, right, agreed to give it that authority. So we the people agreed to give it that authority, therefore it has that authority. The legitimacy of the state derives from that freely given consent of the signatories to transfer or delegate their rights to it. Remember, coming out of the state of nature, you agree to the terms of the contract voluntarily, individually, hand over some of your liberties in order to enjoy the protections afforded by the state. And its role in the mainstream moralized constitutionalist version of the contract, that is Lockean or Kantian, is correspondingly to protect those rights and safeguard the welfare of its citizens. So instead of lording over, as in the racial contract, and ruling subpersons that, by being subpersons, remember that was the first classification, persons versus subpersons, whites versus non-whites, they can't even give their voluntary consent to the terms of the contract. They can't even be signatories to it, even from the start. Now, Noah suggests that if those we agree to give power to are not justly upholding their end of the bargain, then the contract is null and void. And thus the polity, the people being ruled, and the citizens, the polity is under no obligation to obey the laws. Because again, once a contract's broken, the laws are delegitimized. What legitimized them and what made them us obligated to obey them is that they were justified on the basis of a social contract. But once that contract's broken, then they lose all their power and you're no longer under obligation to obey them. So why not loot? Why not just take to the streets? Why not disobey the curfews? Why not just protest? Why not go out and do these things? Because after all, you're no longer under any obligation to recognize the authority of the state, as Noah, that was his analysis, he implied regarding the looting. Now, this assumes, what does this assume? This assumes the U.S. is an idealized liberal democratic state, which is, if it were that, as Mills explains what that means, Mills explains it as, quote, an ethical state, where in the minimalist night watchman Lockean version of enforcing non-interference with citizens' rights, or in the more expansive redistributivist, so you redistribute things, that's its role, version of actively promoting citizens' welfare. So in either case, it's like this ethical state. In both cases, the liberal state, it's neutral, freedom, it's based on freedom and equality. The liberal state is neutral in that it doesn't privilege some citizens over others. Correspondingly, the laws that are passed have as their rationale this juridical regulation of the polity for generally acceptable moral ends. So as citizens of that state that are regarded by the state as free and equal, then you can in a way know that the state is looking out for your best interests and it's not privileging one group of people over the other. So you can the laws that are passed have their rationale in that free and equal people could agree to them and agree to be bound by the laws, by that contract that binds society. Thus, for Noah, this is what his comment suggested, the U.S. has drifted from its liberal democratic ideals, and essentially it's lost its way. It's become unhinged from its ethical moorings. On the classical social contract theory, the state is the ethical state. And as a liberal democratic state, everybody has equal votes and everybody is regarded as free and equal, and one group is privileged over the other. We've sort of lost sight of our ideals as a liberal democratic society. In contrast, for Mills, the U.S. never was or even attained a liberal state that was neutral in its privileging of people. So the U.S., as you know, was founded on the backs of slaves that were not considered fully human, free, or equal signatories to the contract. Though slavery was abolished, juridical regulation and enforcement has always encoded animus or anger or hostility toward Black Americans in the form of segregation, incarceration, and violence to maintain the racial contract. Now, Mills might urge Noah to think that the real contract is still in effect. So remember, Noah was reflecting and saying, wait a minute, given that they haven't lived up to their end of the bargain, and police routinely brutalize those that they're sworn to serve and protect, and those in power routinely, as he ends up saying, loot Black bodies. Therefore, those that are being treated that way, they have no obligation and no motivation to uphold their end of the deal. Some people do, but at that point, it's almost optional. So the contract has been broken. Mills would actually suggest and refine and deepen Noah's thoughts and say that actually the contract is still in place, but it's not the contract you think that was in place. That is, it's the racial contract. It's not the contract of classical social contract theory. Thus, what we're witnessing as a nation is an at-large awakening to the fact that we never lived in a liberal democracy. We're witnessing the epistemology of ignorance, which demands you misrepresent the world as a social contract between free and equal people, exposed for what it is, a lie that perpetuates white supremacy. The contract remains in effect until whites reject the racial contract by sacrificing their privileges and working actively to undermine it, and non-whites assert their power and take back society's benefits not fairly extended to them, whether through peaceful or non-peaceful means, whether through protests or looting. The racial contract explains the other big point Noah raised about police in America looting Black bodies. So this is basically, as I already said, Mills would say to Noah, this is just part of maintaining and reproducing the racial order. In this respect, the officer, Derek Chauvin, was just doing his job in killing Floyd. which explains his calmness. Remember, Noah was taken back, and we all were, by his calmness and lack of responsiveness to calls for concern for the well-being of the black body that he was looting. So you have Charles Mills come along and offer this completely different perspective, and it's super powerful. There are parts of it that I don't agree with. I don't take it all in its entirety, but his view has been important, as I said, in political philosophy, and it offers a really powerful diagnosis of what we're currently witnessing. But I do think if you were still influenced by Mills's racial contract and thinking in those terms, then really what you would suggest is that you would suggest that whites overcome the epistemology of ignorance. That is, with an open mind and a sense of humility, listen to what Black Americans are sharing regarding their experiences of Black anxiety and their suggestions for reform. I have been, and this is not virtue signaling, but just to let you know, I'm not being hypocritical. I'm literally trying to do this. So I'm listening to Black voices with regard to what their experience is in America. What is it like for them daily to live in America and to fear, for instance, going out of the house without their ID because they might fit the description of a perpetrator and thereby be either arrested and imprisoned or shot. Things like that I just don't have to think about. So really, that epistemology of ignorance enforced by the racial contract, just as white Americans trying to open your mind and see what is the experience of others. I think that's an important thing. And then basically, I think taking seriously the things that can, at least in some small way, repair the damage done. Not totally. It's irreparable in some ways. But if we're just looking at how can we in some way heal the wounds, what sort of racial reconciliation is possible? One possibility, and this is what I've heard some Black Americans suggest, is to take seriously affirmative action and to take seriously the possibility of reparation. And so I think we need to actually bring that back up on the table in terms of making it possible for African Americans to have at least a fair chance at some of the positions in society, and also the possibility of, in some sense, rectifying the long history of racial injustice of the United States in the form of reparations. And also those reparations apply to other people that have been damaged by the history. For instance, the Native Americans or the Japanese that were subject to internment and so on. So I think we have to start opening ourselves up to those possibilities. But again, I don't pretend to have all the answers. Those are just things that came to my mind. I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? How can we move forward? It is important to protest. It is important to stand up for your rights and say, this is not right. This is wrong. And we need to take a stand for sure. Oh, but then how do we move forward? I would love to hear your thoughts. There's lots of great stuff going on. So please put your thoughts in the comments. If you know of any group that's doing good work and taking action and bringing about reform, please leave the links in the comments as well so we can get a dialogue going. Please be respectful. And as always, keep thinking ethically so you can live wisely. Keep living the philosophical life.